and we're ready to start.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Murphy. Welcome, folks, to the February 24th, 2021 meeting of the Long Range Planning Committee, or LRPC. My name is James Schroll, and I'm a planning commissioner and a co-chair of the LRPC. For the purposes of tonight's meeting, for the safety of the LRPC members, county staff, members of the public, we are holding this meeting virtually. All participants tonight are joining remotely. We are legally authorized to hold this meeting virtually based on the governor's executive orders, legislation adopted by the Virginia General Assembly, and the county board's continuity of operations ordinance adopted in March of 2020. As this is a virtual meeting, I'd like to orient everyone to our virtual environment and cover a few specifics about how tonight's meeting will run. Tonight's meeting is available to join from the calendar invites Microsoft Teams link, the LRPC webpage, the project webpage, and the county's events calendar, and at the top of tonight's agenda. Additionally, there is a dial-in phone number option for those who wish to use it. And if anyone loses internet connectivity during tonight's meeting, I would encourage you to rejoin the meeting by phone. Please keep all phones and devices muted until you're called upon to do so, as they can cause interference. For everyone joining us via Teams, please turn off your video feed. I'll address when to turn it on in a moment. When called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that is located on your meeting command bar. I do not have the ability to unmute you, and nor does staff. The meeting chat is active to serve three purposes. One, for participants who need technical assistance. Two, for other attendees to pose brief clarifying questions to the larger audience. While these will be monitored, they will not be formally acknowledged. Staff may, however, decide to address those comments as appropriate. And three, for attendees who wish to register to make public comment. If you are interested in making a public comment, please type your desire to do so into the meeting chat with your name. If you could please mute yourself if getting a little bit of feedback, thank you. So again, if you want to wish to make a public comment, please type your desire to do so into the meeting chat function, and we will allow you to make a public comment at the end of the meeting. The meeting chat should not be used for any discussion or any inappropriate statements. Those who are planning to make or provide public comment will still need to do so at the end of the meeting, as the chat will not serve that function. All public comments must be shared verbally for the public record during the assigned public testimony periods. We intend to hopefully conclude by 9 p.m. tonight, but if there's a sense that we're close to reaching, closure on a few items, we hope that there will be a little bit of flexibility to go a little bit over this evening to make sure we get everybody's feedback. For the LRPC members, in addition to being joined by fellow planning commissioners, we are also joined by representatives from each of the three civic associations in the 22202 area. So that's Arlington Ridge, Aurora Highlands, and Crystal City, and the Crystal City Citizens Review Council, or CCCRC. We also have representatives from the Transportation Commission, Housing Commission, and Park and Recreation Commission. If LRPC members wish to be recognized to speak on an item, please either turn on your video feed or raise your virtual hand and leave your microphone muted. I will use the raised hand function and or the video feeds to identify who wishes to speak. Once you've been recognized, you may unmute yourself. Once you have completed your remarks, please mute yourself again and turn off your video feed and lower your virtual hand. Do we have any commissioners or LRPC members joining us by phone this evening? Okay, hearing none. Last kind of introductory remark here is about public comment. As I mentioned previously, if you desire to make a public comment, please type that desire into the chat function. Towards the end of the meeting, the last 10 or 15 minutes or so, we'll move to public comment. At that time, I will identify our public speakers. Please then unmute yourself and turn on your video. After you've concluded your remarks, please once again mute yourself and turn off your video. Lastly, this is a public forum, and tonight's meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the county's website. All information associated with tonight's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to Freedom of Information Act requirements. So with all that, let me just provide a brief overview of the goals of tonight's meeting, and I would like to do some introductions and then pass it over to staff for their presentation. So our objective really this evening is to kind of get an overview of the study's goals, scope, and schedule. We're going to get have a review of staff's analysis and be able to help maybe identify if there's any potential gaps that exist in that. Also, we can consider whether the potential exists for considering additional height here. We can review the draft guidance that is intended to assist staff in their study, and then provide feedback regarding that guidance as well. So this is a preliminary part of this process. We'll be providing staff kind of preliminary feedback. This is not the end of the road, so kind of want to make sure people know that. And with that, before we pass it off to staff, I want to make sure we have an opportunity to do introductions for our members of our LRPC. So with that, Mr. Davanzo. Mr. Davanzo.
Sorry about that. Ben Davanzo.
All right, Mr. Davanzo, I think you're getting a little bit of feedback on one or both of your devices. Mr. All.
Yes, good evening, Chris All, representing CCCRC.
Thank you, Mr. All. Commissioner Guerin.
Thank you, Commissioner Schroll. Nice to see you, Mr. All. Elizabeth Guerin with the Planning Commission, co-chairing this with Commissioner Schroll.
Thank you, Commissioner Guerin. Commissioner Morton.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Morton from the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel.
Good evening. I'm Jane Siegel with the Planning Commission.
Thank you. Commissioner Koopa.
Hi there, Shruti Koopa with the Parks and Rec Commission.
Great. And then if we could do some introductions of staff. So Mr. Lopez.
Good evening. This is Pablo Lopez from CPHC.
Thank you. And Mr. Matusik.
Good evening, everybody. Matt Matusek, also with Comprehensive Planning in the Planning Division.
Mr. Murphy.
Good evening, everyone. Tim Murphy with Arlington's Planning Division, the Comprehensive Planning Section.
All right, thank you all. Are there any members of the LRPC that we did not recognize? Okay, great. So as I mentioned, this is an opportunity for staff to provide us with their kind of preliminary analysis and an opportunity for us to give them feedback and guidance as they're going to embark on the study, and also whether we think that a study to consider additional height is something that we should or could consider for Crystal City. So knowing that it's kind of preliminary, I'd like to pass it off to Mr. Lopez and Mr. Matusek for their presentation. Please hold your questions. We will have ample time to discuss them after their presentation. So pass it off to staff.
Thank you. Actually, Tim was going to start the presentation.
Okay. Mr. Murphy?
Yes, let me pull up the presentation here. And can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. So good evening, members of the LRPC. Tonight, Pablo and I are here to brief you on the Crystal City Building Heights study. Last November, staff presented an overview of background related to the Crystal City Sector Plan with an emphasis on guidance regarding building height, and also an overview of the proposed scope of study. Since that meeting, staff has finalized the scope and moved forward with the initial work of the study. And so tonight we're providing you all with kind of an update on where we are and to seek your feedback. So tonight we're excited to first provide a brief overview of the study's goals, process, and schedule. Review work that staff has conducted to identify the maximum building height potential under the height limits established by the Federal Aviation Administration. Review draft guidance that staff has developed that will be used later in the study to identify potential impacts that could be created by any changes to maximum building heights. And so tonight we seek feedback from the LRPC on the draft guidance in particular, as this document will help us moving forward as we really kind of move into the analysis portion of the study. And so to help inform tonight's discussion, we've provided some questions to help facilitate the conversation. And so with that, we'll first turn our attention to a brief overview of the study. So this study is intended to evaluate whether additional building height could continue to support the vision of the Crystal City Sector Plan, while also providing an opportunity to achieve additional community benefits. Through this study, staff also seeks to identify and mitigate any potential impacts that could be created by increased building heights. And so the study is divided into 4 different phases, shown here in bold. And tonight we'll really be focusing our attention on just the first 2 phases. The first phase is centered on creating guidance that will assist staff during phase 2, the building heights assessment, when we're trying to evaluate potential impacts that could be created by changes to building heights. The second phase, the building heights assessment, is really the main part of the study. The first step to the assessment is to understand how much height could be achieved above the maximum heights in the sector plan while still complying with the height guidance that's set by the FAA. The height framework scenarios that allow for additional height above the maximum heights in the sector plan. And then once we've developed those scenarios, we'll be able to use the guidance to test and evaluate whether the additional height would result in impacts to other elements of the sector plan. The final step of the assessment will be to test and refine height framework scenarios and adjust any additional regulations if necessary to mitigate potential impacts created by increased building height. And then with the assessment complete and hopefully a refined height framework in hand, we then intend to draft an update to the policy guidance, as well as a zoning amendment to implement any proposed changes. And so we first came to the LRPC in November to review the existing height guidance in the sector plan, and also to review a draft scope for this study. At that meeting, we received positive feedback that one, a study of building height guidance was reasonable, and that two, the scope seemed appropriate. So looking ahead, after tonight, we'll seek to incorporate the LRPC's feedback into the draft guidance and move into the main piece of work, which is really developing and evaluating the height framework scenarios within the building heights assessment. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Pablo, who will walk us through the first part of the building heights assessment and the evaluation of building height potential.
Thank you, Tim. My part will focus on the data that we have been working on to lay out the ground for the evaluation the team has mentioned. The purpose is to create a reliable starting point for our evaluation that will take us to the next phases. So no recommendations are resulting from this section or the presentation today. This section just provides an overview of the methodology that we use to arrive at the maximum building height potential. So if you go to the next slide, Tim. So we'll see two sets of information tonight. One is the updated version of the built environment in Crystal City. And the second is the maximum height potential that exists in Crystal City under the Federal Aviation Administration, known as FAA restrictions, which we will quantify and locate within the study area. As you all know, Crystal City is more sensitive to limitations imposed by the FAA, mostly because of the proximity to the airport, Ronald Reagan Airport, but also because of other helicopter routes that overlay the area. Next slide. You'll see in here a pre-sector plan floor plan that is a bit different from the current landscape shown in the following slide. In almost a little bit more than 10 years, a total of 8 buildings have been built and a total of 14 buildings have been approved under the sector plan guidance. What you see here is actually a screenshot of a 3D model that we're developing to better inform the evaluation of the height impacts that we're planning to carry in the next phase. After creating our starting point and to make sure we maintain the goals and objectives established by the sector plan, you can see them in the following slide, we found a necessary next step to look at the height limitations that could be imposed by airspace operations. And to quantify and locate that potential, we have made some calculations that we would like to share with you all tonight. So in the next slide, we compare the maximum building heights map adopted by the board in 2010 to another map that has the FAA height restrictions that you can see in the following slide. There we go. So these numbers here represent the maximum building height that would be allowed under FAA restrictions. Note that these numbers are measured to sea level in feet. As you can see, there's still some room for additional height, as everybody was expecting. Note that the map that you're seeing here is a graphic developed by a private airspace consultant called Capital Airspace Group, and that their efforts have been funded by JBG Smith. They created a 19-page report that was made available to us for the study and is now uploaded in the project website for everyone interested to read. In there, you can find more information about the methodology they used and the data sources that they used. Their study identified obstacle clearance surfaces established by the FAA that could limit structure heights within the defined study area. However, the national landing is still located within protection areas of the airport, and FAA would still have the right to determine that proposed structures would have a significant physical and or electromagnetical effect on the radars, which could result in the termination of HAZAR. After receiving this analysis from the Capital Airspace Group, we added another parameters such as topography information and approved heights in order to be able to create a map that really tells this story. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see a summary of the different calculations that we've done to arrive to what we call the delta height or potential from adopted, which you can see at the bottom under letter E. Letters A and D are the maps that you've already seen. Letter B is the topography, and letters C and E will be the remaining theoretical height potential. So if you look again at the FAA maximum heights measure from sea level and remove the topography showed in the next slide, which is public information that can be found in GIS Open Data Portal from the county, we arrive to map C on the next slide, which is the theoretical building height potential under FAA restrictions. As you can see, this provides high potential that depends merely on the topography and the flight paths from the airport. That's why the areas to the north suffer more restrictions, while areas to the west and areas that are sitting in lower topography, like the block south of 26th Street, have less height restrictions. Now, if you compare this hypothetical height to the height that has already been approved, which you can see in the next slide, then we land into a final map E, which reveals our net height difference, and therefore potential height above and beyond what has already been approved by the board, but still below the FAA restrictions. We can see how in areas around Street 18th and 23rd, the height is mostly already capped out by the approved height, but there's still high potential in most areas of the boundary. It's obvious that the more west of the airport we go, the more high flexibility we see from the FAA. Crystal Drive shows an approximate overall potential of 60 to 100 feet above approved, and properties along Route 1 show a wider range of potential from 60 to 250 feet above approved. Don't forget that, like we mentioned before, this is not a recommendation document. We're just laying out the ground for the evaluation of the building height impacts that will come in the next phase. In the next slide, these are the goals set by the sector plan, which will still be taken into consideration in the case the new height were to be approved. And now Tim will explain how we will proceed with the evaluation of the building height impacts to the other aspects of the sector plan goals.
Great, thanks, Pablo. So in this next section, we'll turn our attention to the draft guidance that we've developed and that we're seeking feedback from the LRPC on tonight. And so we'll see that the guidance really attempts to incorporate each of those different elements that were displayed on the last slide. So to recap, the guidance has been drafted for use as we move further into the building heights assessment to assist staff in evaluating whether a particular height framework scenario generates impacts on other elements of the sector plan. As a checklist of binary questions, the response to each question will help us gauge whether the height scenario we're evaluating is generating an impact, and if so, what steps we could take to mitigate the impact, or if we can't mitigate, whether we ought to then rethink the particular scenario we're looking at. So the first two questions relate to building height planning guidance across the entire sector plan area. The first question relates to compliance with the FAA maximum heights that Pablo reviewed. And the second question relates to the sector plan's desire for a unique skyline. The next two questions in the guidance relate to building height guidance, but for certain geographic areas within the sector plan area. The first question relates to the establishment of nodes of density and height along 18th Street and 23rd Street. The second question here relates to the tapering and the transitioning of height as you move west of Richmond Highway towards Fern Street between 18th and 23rd Street, and then further south towards Eads Street between 23rd Street and Fort Scott Drive in the southern portion of the sector plan area. The next two questions focus on shade impacts to open space. So the sector plan establishes a series of regulations called bulk plane angle guidance, reflected in the bulk plane angle map shown here. And this guidance is applied to specific sites adjacent to planned open spaces. These bulk plane angle regulations control how the top of the building tower is constructed so that the amount of shade that the building generates on the open space is limited. So the first question on this slide focuses on sites that already have existing bulk plane angle requirements. And the second question relates to sites that do not have existing bulk plane angle requirements. And so if a height scenario that we're looking at down the line is developing shade impacts in open space, we'd want to explore either revising bulk plane angle guidance for sites that have existing guidance, or establish new bulk plane angle guidance for sites that currently don't have any bulk plane angle requirements. The final two questions that we've drafted thus far relate to demand impacts on open space and on transportation. As we begin to test scenarios in the building heights assessment, what we'll initially be looking to do is look to increase height while holding other plan regulations constant. In doing so, we'll be able to look at whether the additional height increases density. If density does increase, these questions will help us understand if that density increase is impacting demand for open space in the transportation network. If we're observing impacts that are created by an increase in height and a corresponding increase in density, then we'll want to explore ways that we can mitigate or limit density impacts, such as by examining and making changes to regulations that control massing, including building tower coverage and building tower separation. So to help facilitate tonight's discussion, we've drafted multiple questions for consideration. So we're very interested to get the LRPC's feedback tonight, specifically on the draft guidance, really to confirm whether we're on the right track. We're interested to get the LRPC's views and confirmation that the questions that we're posing are focused on aspects of the sector plan that we do want to carry forward and uphold. Items such as ensuring that there are activity nodes of density and height along 18th and 23rd Street, or that we're ensuring that there's appropriate transitioning of height as we move west of Richmond Highway towards the lower density neighborhoods. So the first question here relates to the existing guidance questions that we've drafted and whether the LRPC thinks that changes might strengthen these existing questions. The second question relates to the three different kind of areas that these existing questions address: building height, open space, and transportation, and whether there might be any additional questions related to these three elements of the plan that we could add to the guidance that could really help us identify impacts to them. And then the final question that we've posed here zooms out a little bit further to ask whether the LRPC believes there might be other elements of the sector plan beyond building height and open space and transportation that might be impacted by allowing for additional building height. And so this concludes our presentation for the evening, and we're really looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy and Mr. Lopez, for your presentation this evening. So I would like to open it up for discussion. I think before we get into some of these three questions that Mr. Murphy walked through, I would like to entertain any questions just regarding kind of the methodology that Mr. Lopez walked through that staff underwent. So if you have any kind of questions about staff's work and analysis regarding the potential height, I'd like to entertain those first, and then we can get into your feedback. Any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. Commissioner Siegel.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Schroll. I'm just a clarification. I am looking at page 95 of the building heights map of the Crystal City sector plan. Could you just go back to the slide? I think you did present this map in the series of slides that you presented. Yeah. I just want to make sure I'm on your page. Yes. So, for example, it's a little easier for me to see it on the paper that I have in front of me, but this is it. I do see along Richmond Highway a building that looks like its limit is 400 feet. Is that right? The reason I ask is I'm just trying to get a fix on how many remaining redevelopment sites would have to grow, let's say, or would their envelope be allowed to increase above this height map? Was that clear as mud?
I can take a stab to answer your question. So I think in terms of the maximum building heights laid out in the map, I believe, and Pablo, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, 300 feet is the maximum. And if you're looking along Richmond Highway, I believe it's, you might be looking at the site north of 23rd Street, perhaps. It looks like it has a 400-foot
yes,
marker.
Exactly.
Okay. So yeah, the 400 feet stretches essentially north of 23rd Street. So that whole area there, the maximum height laid out in the sector plan would be 300 feet.
Why am I at 400 feet then? That's what it's confusing me.
Yeah, I think the 400 feet denotes essentially the length of the zone, of the 300-foot zone.
Oh yes. I see. So it is not a height. Oh, that the length of that particular building site,
or the length of that particular height zone. So that zone is 300 foot.
That's what that is.
Yeah, it's a little unclear.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. Your second question, I believe, was about sites that potentially have potential for that have, I guess, have not yet been redeveloped. And so what we've started to account for in our model already that Pablo touched on, we've gone ahead and built in, and you can kind of start to see here. Let me scroll back to the previous slide. We've started to add in the sites where we've gotten kind of completed and approved projects since the sector plan was adopted. So we're going to be able to account for recent development as we do this study of potential increases in height, and really be able to account for those sites that have the recent development and recent approvals, as well as kind of existing pre-2010 existing buildings that may not have redevelopment potential at this point.
So you don't really know that now. This exercise is meant to generate the information that will allow us to know that number when the time comes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel. Mr. All, I saw your hand raised. Do you have a question or was it answered?
It was answered. It was the clarification that was provided about the 400 feet.
All right, thank you. Are there any other kind of questions about staff's initial analysis before we move into Mr. Murphy's or staff's kind of first suggested question? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. We can certainly come back if folks have kind of questions that arise during the discussion. So Mr. Murphy's first question, you know, are the revisions needed to the existing questions to help better identify the potential impacts? So Mr. Murphy did walk through the existing questions around building height, open space, and transportation. Perhaps we can take them in turn. So Mr. Murphy, if you would like to go back to your first question or set of questions about building height, let's start here. Are there any kind of reactions to these, Mr. All?
Yes, thank you. I think there is one word that I have not heard during the presentation or seen in the material, and that is density. I think not many may be clear about the reality that when building heights were discussed in the sector plan development, it was not just a matter of, sort of, apart from looking at FAA or tapering to the nearby neighborhood, a matter of figuring out which blocks and which parcels ought to have what heights in relation to each other or in their own right. And that building heights was something that one could sort of just sort of weigh that, well, should it be 200 or should it be 300, and what fits better there, and that being it. It was also very much used as a proxy for the question of what density overall for the entire sector plan ought to be allowed. And I think the current number that still stands is 61%. And to a large extent, apart from sort of base densities per
Mr. All?
Yes.
I certainly want to get back to this question, but I think your points generally fit more under kind of what's missing, which is the question number 2. So to the extent that you have feedback on either of the 2 questions on the screen, I would certainly like to entertain that. If not, I can certainly come back to you for your comments about some of the things that are missing later in our discussion.
Whatever sequence you prefer.
Thank you, Mr. All. Commissioner Morton.
Thank you. This is just a basic question because I don't know much about FAA. Is it typical for a local government to go all the way up to the maximum height limit recommended? You know, do you need to leave some sort of cushion, or they, you know, they think that that's fine and they're not going to change it or something like that?
So I'm happy to take this one, and Pablo, feel free to jump in if you feel like it. Our understanding is that the FAA will essentially issue their notice of no hazard. I think the FAA generally is willing to allow or entertain heights up to / close to the maximums that they establish. But I think with our study, we're not necessarily willing to just jump to the maximum FAA height. We want this study to be deliberate and ensure that we're balancing the existing vision and the goals of the sector plan with the activity nodes and with the height tapering towards the lower density residential areas, that we continue to carry those forward. So while we'll be exploring changes to building height, we definitely want to be mindful of the existing sector plan.
Sure. Okay. I wondered if there was just some rule of thumb, but beyond the goals that you've talked about. So thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Morton. Any other questions or feedback on the wording of the questions here on the screen? Mr. All. Mr. All, were you seeking recognition? Okay.
No.
Okay. Commissioner Gearin.
Thanks, Commissioner Schroll. I would like some more information about what we mean with regard to a skyline with varying heights. And this gets back to not really knowing what the intent was when the sector plan was put together and what we have in mind. Is it something like the peaks and valleys along the RB corridor, or was something else intended?
So I'm happy to take that one. So the sector plan does have an entire section that's dedicated to one moment to the point or the emphasis on developing a skyline with varying heights. And really what I think it was trying to establish was a unique flow to the skyline, sort of if you're, I guess, looking across the Potomac from the district, you're seeing a skyline that begins to rise as you reach 18th Street, lowers back down, rises again as you approach 23rd Street, and then lowers back down. And so I think it was really more about trying to establish sort of a feel for the skyline. And I think what we've seen thus far, the skyline as it's currently kind of composed is generally a little flatter. And I think it also establishes more of a centralized area of greater height between Crystal Drive and between Richmond Highway to really kind of create this spine of undulating height as you go down Richmond Highway.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. I am going to hope that my colleagues with more design experience will also weigh in on that then, since this sounds like a bit of an art and a science.
Thank you, Commissioner Gearin. Before we go to Mr. All, Mr. Murphy, it looks like there are some members of the LRPC that are, I think, that are on the attendees list. If you could raise them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
I can do that.
Great, thank you. Mr. All.
Thank you. First, in the meantime, apropos the question of skyline with various heights, my clear recollection is that there were two considerations when it comes to the varying or undulating. One was the vista from the east, from across the river, and to a lesser extent from Richmond Highway or the community beyond. But there was also a great emphasis on, say, differentiation, undulation within the area of Crystal City, east of Richmond Highway, the sense that from one block to the next, from one massive building to the next, that there should not be uniformity, but also looking from building to building, one wanted differentiation. And that's why two specific blocks were separated out as meriting the higher limits. But then I would want to go back to my point from earlier. We are talking about height as if it was totally, at the time of the sector plan, a standalone consideration where one found for the most part that there was pressure to increase heights beyond those that exist in the sector today. And that the arguments between county and the then dominating landowner were particularly along the lines that it's not going to be, someone talked about art and science, realistic to create building massing and sculpting in a way that takes advantage of those building heights, and that the building heights would really instead create pressure for increased density if one went for some of those higher limits that some people wanted at the time. So that a lot of the limits that were set were really weighed together to create the relative increase in density that a plan ought to allow. So that therefore any, say, unilateral increase at this point in time in the plan itself for one block or one parcel and so on would of course then create a conflict with the expectations, understandings in terms of density, unless there was a major, I wouldn't dare say mitigation, but a difference in approach to massing and sculpting than has been anticipated so far. So I think it's not just a matter of saying that, well, because it's possible, we can go ahead and increase building heights in different areas without an understanding that there is an offset or not, rather than just a mitigation in terms of the density it would lead to, not just transportation, open space, and so on.
Thank you, Mr. All. Mr. Davanzo.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me this time with no echo.
It's better.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes.
Can you hear me at all this time?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry, thank you. Sorry, just raising a different issue, and I wanted to find the slide about, as you all might imagine, right, Aurora Highlands is going to be particularly interested in the tapering, especially, you know, I can imagine members of my community seeing the proposed map of where heights can increase the most, and of course it's just the way the math works, but with the heights potentially being the biggest in Aurora Highlands, I know that's probably not the intention. So there is the bullet point. Did the proposed changes result in tapering in key locations that responds appropriately to lower density residential areas? It's an important question. I will flag the key locations, as in, you know, are there areas where we would not want appropriate tapering? So that is, I'm not sure if that's intended to signify or anything, that phrase key locations, that there might be areas where tapering is more or less important. It's a little kind of nitpicking on words, but I just wanted to, because I think folks might pay attention to that in particular. I wanted to raise it.
Yeah, let me see if Mr. Murphy or Mr. Lopez would like to address that piece about whether there are locations where tapering may not be as important. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Lopez?
Yeah, absolutely. So the intention there, I think the key locations phrase, really what I think what we were trying to get at was within the sector plans, goals, and objectives, one of the goals is to preserve the integrity of the single-family neighborhood in the west, or to the west. And the two objectives that follow that goal specifically call out two areas. The area, I guess it's east of, or rather west of Eads Street, between Eads and Fern, between 18th and 23rd Street, and then the area further south, west of Richmond Highway, between Richmond Highway and Eads Street. I believe it's between 23rd Street and Fort Scott Drive. And so the key locations phrase here really was referring to the goals and objectives of the sector plan, where it calls out specifically these areas. But I could see how the key locations could potentially be misinterpreted, I guess. So what we're really trying to get at with this question is, does the LRPC still see these areas as areas where tapering should continue to remain, even with a new, if there is a new height framework or the ability to access additional height? Would the LRPC want to continue to see tapering in these areas?
Okay, that's helpful to know that key locations is intended to refer to the key areas identified in the sector plan. I don't know if it's worth saying that explicitly or not, because this is right. If your staff are saying this and you and staff is following the document, I think that's fine, but it'd be good to, it's helpful to know to be able to explain to the community.
Absolutely, yeah, we can make that change and repost this to the website with that additional detail too.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy and Mr. Davanzo. And I think to your other question, Mr. Davanzo, regarding the height potential, going to have maybe Mr. Lopez speak to this, but I think it was certainly just staff's intention to show in their analysis the height potential that exists, not that, I think Mr. Lopez noted this in his presentation, that it wasn't staff's intention at this stage to be proposing heights, but just to show what height exists below the FAA limits. So I don't know if Mr. Lopez or Mr. Murphy, if you would like to speak to that in any greater detail, but certainly go ahead if you'd like to.
Yeah, this is Pablo. I think you, one second,
I'll put the other mic. Yeah. So yeah, I think you're right, Mr. Schroll. The purpose was just to lay out the ground and to have a starting point of what the options are, and then we would go into the next phase that Tim mentioned, and we will evaluate what impacts would have to the other goals that are in the sector plan. So we will always have in mind the goals of the sector plan. This is just data that we want to have on the table.
Great. Yep. Thank you, Mr. Lopez. Are there any other, Mr. Murphy, if we could go back to the slide with the building heights questions, are there other questions related to, I guess we could maybe go to the next slide, Mr. Murphy. Okay, are there any kind of questions or feedback regarding this slide? Commissioner Siegel.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Schroll. Let me frame this efficiently, this question. So, I guess I need just a little more guidance from staff. I'm just sort of reviewing the goals and objectives of the Crystal City Sector Plan and some other peace policies here. I guess this will help shorten the conversation or shorten my concerns. The questions that you have formulated pick out, in this case, specific areas where the heights additional height could be added. And so I think, are we at a level of detail, sort of the big headings, and then will you then further articulate, if you answer this question, would you then further articulate those issues that could emerge if we decide that that's where the greatest height should be? I mean, it's a fundamental question. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just sort of trying to understand what the thought process will be going forward. You've got open space, you've got heights, open space and transportation network, but there are other things specified in the Crystal City Sector Plan. Question that arises in my mind is, would that have to be changed? Would there have to be a change in the street network? That's a transportation question. Would there have to be a change in the build-to line or the placement of the building, the orientation of the building? Would there have to be changes in the sculpting of the building? How do you envision, I guess maybe you can answer this question, or maybe you can't at this point, how, once you frame the bigger questions, the broader questions that you're answering, that you're asking us to evaluate, would you then go back to the sector plan and sort of do a little checklist? Okay, if we allow 50 more feet here and 100 more feet there, what does that change placement of the building, build-to line, street design? Is that the way your thinking will go?
So I think with this guidance, what we've tried to do is to draft it with these questions in mind as a checklist, to focus on these, like the big kind of overarching elements of the plan, the goals, the vision. So the undulating skyline, activity nodes, tapering and transitions, open space, etc. I think once we have this guidance finalized, as we go into evaluating or developing a height framework scenario, and then evaluating it with this checklist, part of what that's going to entail is we've talked a little bit about if, as we start this process where we would only be potentially changing height and leaving other regulations constant, which would potentially lead to an increase in density. And so we would want to understand what impacts does that generate. And I think as we go through that process, we'll see that an increase in density would most likely or potentially create impacts. So how are we going to control for that density? And that's where then we start to get into the items that you described, the build-to lines, the building tower coverage, the building tower separation. Are those things that we ought to further refine to ensure that we're controlling and the orientation of the building, et cetera, to ensure that we're still ending up in a place that the plan is still being, the vision is still being carried forward.
Great. Okay, that looks extremely helpful in my being able to give you productive comments. I appreciate that. Thank you. I don't want to talk about it now, but I hope we can return to the question of the skyline. I'm a little confused about it. It does appear to be kind of flat and bulky. It certainly isn't peaks and valleys, and you said undulating, but perhaps we can talk about that later.
Well, Commissioner Siegel, I think if you have a comment about, so Mr. Murphy, if you can go back to the previous slide, thank you, about this second bullet here, if you'd like to address it now, since there is language about this, and maybe if you think it's not sufficient, we'd welcome your comments.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Schroll. Yeah, it does seem to me that the current set of guidelines for Crystal City has produced a sort of flat skyline, not interesting. So that I guess my comment would be to allow greater heights along, as you say, the spine with the tapering to the neighborhoods would be welcome. So I guess I'll just leave you with that comment, and hopefully, again, as you go through the process, you might just review why, how it was we've kind of, is this skyline that we see now what was intended in 2010 or not? That would be a question that I would have in mind as you look at changing the heights.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel. Commissioner Morton.
Thank you. I want to echo the comments made by Commissioner Gearan and Siegel. I was going to say this later, but I think this is the right time. I agree that varying heights in and of itself isn't necessarily going to create any sort of dynamic or interesting undulating sense. And since the word undulating has come up, I'm sorry I don't have the plan in front of me, but I do know there is some urban design language there. I'd really love to see, maybe varying heights can stay in there, but if the word undulating, in really a more fine grain, we don't want, like K Street, or like, as Commissioner Siegel points out, the condition we have, just, it varying, like step backs. We want a more fine grain. I think Mr. All talked about pinpointing smaller blocks with different height. So I love to see something besides just a numeric measurement like height, and specifically call out what language we can from the plan about that conveys undulating, whether in a more fine-grained way, whether it's tapering or sculpting or variety. And I love Commissioner Siegel's question about how did we get to this point where we are now with all of the, not super exciting buildings, and can we use this as an opportunity to re-examine?
Thank you, Commissioner Morton. Reminder to folks to take down their virtual hand when they're done with their comments. Commissioner Steinberger.
Thank you. Sorry, the lighting in my office is very awkward tonight. So I wanted to really, I think Commissioner Morton in many ways touched on where I was going with this is, and in reiterating what some other folks have said as well, I do want to sort of have that greater variation and be able to sort of look at some of the, if we're looking at different height requirements, some of the smaller blocks, and if that's going to get us to the point where we can have, whether it's undulation or just that greater variety. What I would be concerned with in increasing heights uniformly or with any kind of approach towards that is that we would simply end up with kind of a taller building that's still a kind of flat sense of skyline. And I think what I'm interested in, what I'm hearing from other folks, is that we get that sort of variation that leads to a more visually interesting skyline effect. And I don't think that we will necessarily get there, as Commissioner Morton said, simply by giving guidance on height. I think we need some other guidance included along with height guidance. So what that looks like, I'm not a designer, and I would be interested in what other folks would suggest for that as well. But I think that's necessary to get us where I think we ultimately want to go in terms of that variation. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Steinberger. I don't know if staff wants to weigh in on these recent comments by Commissioner Steinberger, Commissioner Morton, Commissioner Siegel regarding that height variation. But I think in my discussions with staff, it was the intention to, if there were additional height, to try to maintain the variation that exists in the underlying plan. So I don't know if Mr. Murphy or Mr. Lopez would like to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I think these comments are very helpful. I think especially as we start to get into the building heights assessment and really start to develop these height framework scenarios, this will be where we'll actually be able to test different types of frameworks. Frameworks where we're looking at height increases potentially allowable throughout the sector plan area versus just in certain locations. So it's going to be very interesting over the next couple months where we're able to actually start to test out different scenarios. And so I think based on the feedback from Commissioner Steinberger and Commissioner Morton and Commissioner Siegel thus far, I think we'll be able to experiment with different ways to try to promote this variation on different sites within kind of the core area. And I could foresee that being a scenario that we look at moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. I'd like to go to Mr. All, and then I'd like to move us on to other questions that staff has. So Mr. All.
Just two observations. I think in judging whether we are on the right track in moving from pre-sector plan to a fully built out sector plan, that after very little action for a number of years, we are only a small distance from pre to post, so to speak. And that therefore to judge from today's situation is in one way very difficult in determining whether what a sector plan envisages is what we desire. But also to point out that among those few buildings that we already have had built and that you have before you in SPRC at this moment and just recently approved, that we have great differences between what the sector plan illustrates and what has in fact been approved or is being proposed. So I think to just stare at the illustrations, because that's all they really were meant to be in the sector plan, may not be as helpful as one might think.
Thank you, Mr. All. Reminder to folks to lower your virtual hands if you don't have any additional thoughts to share. Mr. Murphy, if we could continue on to the next slide here. Okay, are there any other pieces of feedback here? Commissioner Steinberger, are you seeking recognition? All right.
Nope, that was an error, sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner Steinberger. We did have some feedback here about the second bullet here, and I think staff will further clarify what key locations means for the purposes of TAPER and its reference. Commissioner Morton.
Hi, I hope this is the right place to say this. I had noted before you had something called a neighborhood node, which I thought might mean the sort of smaller commercial neighborhood centers, but then I don't know if that's incorporated into the lower density. I didn't see that language come up again, I believe, in your study impact. Is that something that you're looking at specifically? Or is neighborhood node that concentrated high density, like sort of the opposite of what I thought it was supposed to mean?
The latter. So we the nodes that we were referring to dealt with the more concentrated centers of activity along 18th and 23rd Streets.
So you have the lower density residential areas as something you're paying close attention to. Is there some sort of attention you're paying to lower density commercial areas?
So that is an excellent point. So at the way we've currently constructed this, our questions aren't necessarily pointed at those, but I think this type of response is very helpful in that as we're rounding out this guidance, an additional question like that I think adds a lot of value as we're exploring different scenarios. So we could absolutely add a question like that to the guidance. I think that would add a lot of value.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Morton. Commissioner Siegel.
18th Street and 23rd Street that you call out here. I'm going to suggest, or let me put it to just straight question. You are, I'm sure, aware of the Route 1 study that VDOT is conducting. That is the case, correct? You're aware of it?
Yes, correct.
Okay. I had occasion to listen to a presentation last night from VDOT with Neighborhood Review. The livability group did some review, and 18th Street and 23rd Street are focal points for this study. And I guess nothing is determined. The study is ongoing, but the general idea, at least from the and VDOT has heard this message. I don't know whether in this phase of the study there we'll see any actual language or design to support better pedestrian connections. And the reason I raise it is that Route 1 is very forbidding and wide, and the traffic is scary when you're trying to cross. And I just do think that since 18th Street and 23rd Street are a focal point for both the Heights map and for the study, that staff, as you develop your questions, you should just cast an eye toward what the Route 1 study might be coming up with in terms of more pedestrian activity and more retail or more activation of one sort or the other that would hopefully be incentivized by a change in those east-west crossings. So it's just something, it's outside the scope, I guess, of, well, it's not, it's Route 1, so it's right in the scope. Anyway, so yes, you should be aware of the Route 1 study, and as you evaluate transportation network is what I think I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we are definitely aware of VDOT study, and VDOT is aware of our study as well. So we are and will continue to monitor their progress moving forward. And I think pedestrian connectivity, part of this study, as we start to evaluate, after we've evaluated scenarios for potential impacts, the part of this study will be about kind of the equation between allowing for additional height and community benefits. And so I could see, potentially there being some sort of nexus between pedestrian connectivity and sort of the allowance for additional height potentially down the line.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Let us move to the next slide, Mr. Murphy. So any questions here regarding these two questions posed by staff regarding open space any feedback you might have regarding these. So I particularly want to take people's feedback on these questions specifically. We have another question about what's missing, what else we want to see. So please, to the extent that they are about these, I'd like to entertain those. Commissioner Morton.
Thank you, and apologies if I'm going against your guidance. I would like to see, rather than just do the proposed changes result in shade impacts, can we say shade and microclimate impacts? I mean, there are other things like wind and sun reflection and heat island effect from, that green roofs might mitigate. Is that something you can put into that question, or is that in the what are we leaving out category?
I think that's germane to this, so I think that is perfectly fine to ask. Mr. Murphy, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I would also say that, yeah, that definitely relates to kind of these questions, and I think that we could explore adding that additional language, the microclimate impacts, and wind and some of the other items that you mentioned, we can definitely kind of work those into potential impacts. I guess a question, Commissioner Morton, would you think that say that these would be impacts focused on open space specifically, or more broadly? How would you put them?
Yeah. Some of them would impact open space, like wind, for example, and then there are other kinds of things that would affect, the general neighborhood, the reflection, and maybe the urban heat island and things like that. So, yeah, you're right. It may be a little bit, beyond open space, but it certainly there are real impacts besides just shade of tall buildings on open space, which can be positive or negative.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Morton. Commissioner Koopa.
Hi there. Thank you, Elizabeth, for those comments. I think that I definitely agree with everything you just said. So thank you for that. And I also just want to be mindful and thankful that we're here today to talk about this issue of open space and the availability of it in this area in general. And this is an opportunity for us to continue to ask for as much commitment to open space as possible here. And we want to be as specific as possible. And I really want to associate myself with those climate reform kind of pieces here. Yeah, I just wanted to associate myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Koopa. Any other comments, questions related to these questions regarding open space? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so it seems like these are acceptable to folks. Mr. Murphy, if you could move to the next slide, please. Okay, let's entertain any questions, feedback on the last question here on open space before we move to transportation, regarding the proposed heights, results, and demand kind of for open space. Thoughts, questions, feedback? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Sounds like that's an acceptable as phrase. Let's move on to transportation. Any thoughts on this question as worded? Any feedback?
Oops, sorry.
Chairman Slatt.
Yeah, I would just say in general, I find this an uncomfortable premise. I'm kind of the opinion that we build our transportation network to support the neighborhood that we want to build and not constrain our neighborhood based on the existing transportation network that we have. So I don't like the question from a height perspective in the first place, personally. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Slatt. Commissioner Siegel.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Slatt, but I think I would put it this way. I think, let's see. The changes in height will result in changes in density. I guess we can talk about how density would figure into this because it's very much present in the Crystal City Sector Plan when we get to what's missing. So maybe put it this way: when you say, do the changes in height result in demand and the impacts coming from demand on the transportation network? I'm sure you've anticipated a bit what that might look like. Can you could you just elaborate a little bit? Will you recommend? Would a change in height recommend traffic calming, road narrowing? Would it mean more bikes, more mode split? Can you just in a little bit more what you will do if you see impacts and what you give me an example of what you think such an impact might be?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess stepping back for a moment. So as part of this study, we've convened an interdepartmental working group. And so we have folks from DES, TE&O on our team that we'll be working with moving forward into this, as we move into really the assessment phase and testing scenarios phase. And so part of that will involve looking at the transportation analysis and transportation modeling that has been done in the past for Crystal City and the Pentagon City area. But so really, this question, it is in a way addressing, at least initially, if we're looking at a change in height that also has a corresponding increase in density, we're interested to be able to see the impacts on the transportation network. What could be a result of that analysis could be, number one, are there TDM strategies that could be employed to help mitigate the transportation network impacts, such as traffic calming or ensuring that there's more bike and ped, more mode split, et cetera. The other approach that we could look at really from the density perspective is controlling for massing of buildings to ensure that really we're controlling the density. We're either ensuring that density is not increasing or density is increasing only up to a certain point, whereby we're observing that demand impacts really are being mitigated to a certain degree by the massing and by controlling for density a little bit more. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Siegel?
It does. It does, and use comes to mind too, because you have different impacts with an apartment building, a residential building, and a commercial building. I think CO Crystal City doesn't dictate site by site what the use is. There's an overall balance that's recommended, but use, I think, would have to come into it some way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel. Commissioner Lantelmi.
Yeah, first I want to associate myself with Commissioner Slat's comments, and I would switch the question around to say, what changes in transportation demand management strategies will be necessary to support additional height or in response to additional height? No city has, that I'm aware of, or successful city has limited what goes in their downtowns because of their street network. Lower Manhattan has been growing for the, over a colonial street network and a century-old rapid transit network. And, it's been continuing to grow and be supported, and that's the way it is. The same with downtown Boston, downtown Philadelphia. Those networks have been there forever, and they support what goes there, and it's simply not an issue. I think we're looking at this sort of through the wrong end of the telescope. That's my comment.
Thank you, Commissioner Lantelmi. Mr. All.
Thank you. I think the most recent comments suggest the drawbacks of trying to tackle one element of a sector plan in isolation. We have now, during a number of years, come up against all kinds of obstacles. No, the sector plan doesn't allow that. No, the sector plan doesn't support it or require it. So that has to await a revision of the sector plan. I would suggest that for some elements, such as bulk plane angles, massing, and so on, that you cannot just change the sector plans, tear out one page for building heights and replace it with another one with generally or in some locations increased heights without looking at those aspects. When you then come to the ones on this page, I agree with Commissioners Lantelmi and Slat that the questions are asked a bit backwards. But that to some extent, there is still a dilemma, chicken versus egg, because you don't really know just by saying that you allow increased building heights, blanket fashion, or in some specific areas, what the impact is without looking at so many other aspects. You don't know what the impact is on transportation. You don't know what transportation and provisions have to be changed in order to accommodate. And the same thing for open space. I think as Commissioner Morton was hinting that there are more than one dimension to the question of open space, what the impact is. But sort of just talking in a very generic term about increasing the building heights is not enough. You need to accompany it by looking at the other elements in the sector plan at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. All. Commissioner Slat.
This is just me utterly failing to lower my hand after the last time I spoke. My apologies.
No worries. Just a reminder, folks, yes, please do lower your virtual hands. Commissioner Lantelmi, did you seek recognition? Nope. Okay. So I don't see any more hands on the general transportation feedback on this slide. Let's move to your other questions, Mr. Murphy. So this is question 2 here. So this is where there might not have been a question about these 3 topics included in staff's guidance, something missing there. Mr. Davanzo.
So I was thinking about commenting on this for the last question we were just discussing. I said to say to this, just because I do think, right, the sector plan is very particular about transportation, and I sort of agree with some of the comments, right, about, what are we building for transportation? Are we transporting for buildings? as well as open space, right? There's other things that we care about and that the community has identified as priorities that could be positively or negatively impacted by heights and additional density. And I'm thinking housing, for example, right? We need more of it. So additional density and heights could be helpful for that, if, but also schools and additional density and heights, if we don't have enough schools, can be counteracted for that. And in some ways, I feel like this is kind of getting down the road of like all the questions we're examining in the Pentagon City sector plan, which is, you know, the questions that you answer when you're trying to account for more density. I'm not really sure. I don't know if I'm suggesting an additional question, except for there are additional aspects that you look at as a community, both positives and negatives, that come with additional density that I didn't see identified here.
Thank you, Mr. Davanzo. We heard several kind of folks who were kind of critical of the way the wording of the transportation question was on the previous slide. We did hear already some feedback on that from folks of ways to kind of reconfigure that question. Are there other things that people would like to share or on that piece, since that was raised specifically? If not, that's okay, but wanted to at least give an opportunity if people wanted to speak to that. Chairman Slatt.
Thank you. Yeah, I think building on something somebody else said earlier, I can't remember if it was Commissioner Lantelmi or somebody else. I think we really need to be thinking about this in terms of mode split. Arlington is certainly not full. Crystal City is certainly not full, and the question we really need to be asking is what can this building do to support, you know, a shift to more efficient, you know, space efficient transportation modes to account for its, you know, density and height. You know, whether that, you know, essentially, people walking take up a lot less space than a car, people biking take up a lot less space than a car, and a bunch of people in a bus take up a lot less space than those same number of people in their single occupancy vehicles. So, you know, allowing people to still be mobile as we have more people, more neighbors in the area is all about enabling that mode shift to more space efficient means. So I think that's really the question that we need to be asking, is just making sure that the building is doing what it can to support that shift. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Van Hine. Ms. Van Hine?
I was not muted. You can hear me okay?
I can.
Good. I want to enthusiastically second what Chris Slatt just said, and that currently using the Crystal City sector plan to implement a lot of the transportation needs that we need is not really adequate for the mode shift, and somehow we need to support making changes that will support our future shifts in modals, especially for biking and walking and transit. It's just, we're not providing enough space when we're planning these new sites to adequately provide for all the people that are going to be doing all these different modes. So I hope we can work on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Van Hine. Are there other additional questions, you know, on these three subjects: building height, open space, transportation, that could help, you know, staff in their evaluation? If not, then we can move on to the last question here before we open it up for public comment. Again, reminder to folks, if they would like to make public comment, now's a good time to type that into the chat feature that your desire to do so, and we'll add you to the list. I'm not seeing any other hands raised now for additional questions for number 2 here on the discussion list. So let's move on to number 3, which is kind of missing guidance from staff's list. So things outside of building height, open space, and transportation. So are there things that you think staff should consider outside of those 3 areas? All right, I'm not seeing any hands so far. Please raise your hand if you your virtual hand here if you have something to share. Mr. All.
Thank you. It's not specifically to any of these 3 points in front of us.
No, that's okay. It's actually number 3 is anything outside of those 3. Yep.
Yeah. No, it's more trying to pull together some of the comments that I have tried to get across earlier. When we go back to the time last year, when the question of increasing height limits first came up, it was in connection with one anticipated development project, but of course with the understanding that it would be something that also could, as the need arose, be applied to other projects and proposals. But what I want to underscore is that there is a huge difference between saying that the Crystal City plan without a revision has building heights limits determined, and that does not change short of a plan revision, but that an overlay almost literally where the county determines that if and when the issue arises, that we would know in advance when hearing from a developer about their ideas, whether and where and to what extent a limit could be increased for a particular block or parcel, but with an understanding that that would be something that required a quid pro quo in some form, like in the case of going beyond established building heights or densities in the current situation. And that I think when so many of us, myself included, in the community strongly supported moving ahead with this study, it was with that latter understanding that it would not be, as I put it earlier, tearing the page out of the sector plan and saying that from now on, the following heights apply block by block, parcel by parcel. But that there is this awareness that to the extent a request comes up, that we know what could be considered, but with conditions and with understandings, not just sort of mitigation of the effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. All. Anybody else wish to suggest elements that might be missing from staff guidance aside from those included? So for members of the public that wish to speak, please type that into the chat feature. So Mr. Boutsas, I will add you to the list. We will entertain public comment here shortly. Commissioner Morton.
Thank you. I'm not aware of local historic districts or sites in this immediate vicinity, but I'm not sure that, it's never going to happen. Does it make sense to include a reference to impacts on just bringing in the historic preservation plan? I'm thinking about 23rd Street, for example, which I believe is a National Register district, but not a local district, but still a historic resource.
Yeah, I think that that is something that we could potentially explore. In developing the guidance thus far, that wasn't something that we had considered, but I think we can definitely go back and review kind of our historic resources and work with our historic preservation staff to identify whether and where any historic resources are located in the sector plan area. And we could craft a question related to changes in building height and any kind of potential transitioning or impacts, I guess, what transitioning or impacts on the historic resources. Is that what you kind of have in mind?
Potentially. There are a lot of different ways of looking at it, but if we're thinking about what components of the plan is missing, that's one that I think should be at least reviewed.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Other thoughts from members of the LRPC? Okay, not seeing any hands here. So I think what I'd like to do is, unless there's other thoughts, go to public comment. I think we have one individual who's indicated want to speak. Then go to my co-chair, Commissioner Gearin, who's been taking notes for her wrap up of what she's heard tonight from all of us, and then go to Mr. Murphy and Mr. Lopez for next steps. So I don't see any other hands from planning commissioners or members of the LRPC. So let us now go to Stratis Boutzis. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. If you can turn on your video and unmute yourself.
Hello?
Hi, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
you can hear me. Good evening, everyone. I've been listening to this with great interest, and I do like the introduction of peaks and troughs into the height. Gives it some interest, especially, it gives Crystal City an identity, national landing, an identity. And what I want to focus on is identity. Right now, we are cultivating an Amazon identity, but there are some other identities there. And we should, as you plan, as you go along on this, you should look at preserving and protecting the identities that are there. And I mean, you should build on the past. I mean, I'm of course a proponent for 23rd Street. As a whole, we should start looking at the identities we want to create, what we want to protect, the type of neighborhoods we want, and the identities we want. And it's somehow the sector plan misses out on identity. It's not very clear there. And I'd like that addressed in a way. What sort of identities do we want? We've got Virginia Tech campus coming, you've got Amazon, you've got Pentagon City, and everything's first. So how do we preserve the identities we have? And I'd just like to just add comment on that, and that's it.
Thank you very much for your comments this evening and for attending. Are there other folks that wish to provide a public comment? Not seeing any. Again, if you would like to do so, please type so into the chat function. All right, not seeing any. All right. If you do have additional things to share, you can always send them to Mr. Murphy or myself subsequent to the meeting if you have feedback you'd like to share. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Gearan for kind of her summary of our discussion and maybe where some of the areas of consensus were regarding additional guidance for this study. Commissioner Gearan?
Thank you, Commissioner Scholl. So most of the comments came with regard to the first big question that staff posed to us. Are revisions needed to the existing questions to help better identify potential impacts? Commissioner Morton asked if it was typical for local jurisdictions to go up to maximum heights per FAA. And while staff said they want to be mindful of the sector plan, I thought that was an interesting question, and it might be useful to know if we do know of comparable jurisdictions that go up to that, or if they typically do leave a little cushion. There seemed to be broad support for a visually interesting skyline, and trying to give more information as to what staff means by this going forward, considering the provision of some additional language to maybe operationalize what is meant by that. And here, several of us weighed in on support for this, but also wanting to know what is meant, and perhaps using more urban design language from the sector plan, specifically the word undulating, since that was something that came up several times. Clarifying areas where tapering is recommended, and perhaps referencing the planning docs and the history, including what key locations means with reference to that term. Commissioner Siegel raised a question, and I don't know if that relates specifically to the question staff has, or if it's just something they might want to include in follow-up when this goes out more broadly, but whether or not these potential height additions also will mean that there'll be changes to setbacks and build-to lines and so on. And this gets at something that Mr. All referenced also, but I thought that was an interesting point and something that people might be questioning as they read these. There was questions about whether there were similar focus areas for areas of low density commercial areas. We wanted to comment on that. There was a question that the question on changes of height impacting transportation demand might be backwards, and perhaps we wanted to phrase this in the form that with the higher heights, are any buildings that get these higher heights doing what they can to support other transportation modes? And with regard to the questions about impacts of shade with higher height buildings, Commissioner Morton, and then supported by others, including Commissioner Kupa, support language that goes beyond that and asks about impacts on wind, urban heat island, and other microclimate effects. With regard to the second question that staff posed, are there additional questions related to building height, open space transportation that could help identify impacts? I think this is where Mr. All's comment that we want to be clear that the sector plan's intent noted that heights were related to density, and that might be something we want to call out here and make clear that there is definitely a relationship with that. With greater height comes greater density. We're not simply talking about taller buildings with the same density. And there was a note that there are other areas that the community cares about that might be impacted by additional heights, such as housing, perhaps positively impacted by additional heights and additional densities, and schools perhaps negatively impacted. And then with regard to the third question, are there other plan elements missing from the guidance? Commissioner Morton raised this idea, and I want to support this. I think this is an excellent point, that we might want to consider the references to the impacts on historic preservation, including 23rd Street, even if something hasn't been designated yet. I would personally be interested in knowing what the historic preservation staff thinks of some of those areas that do provide some placemaking and that seem to have some historic import that have been there for a while as we see a lot of change going forward in the community. And that's all I have on the comments, Commissioner Scholl.
Thank you, Commissioner Guerin, for summarizing our conversation this evening. That was a very good summary of the points that were raised and points that were made. Mr. Murphy, I'd like to just maybe in conclusion kind of turn it over to you to discuss the timeline and next steps. So Mr. Murphy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner. To the LRPC and to our public commenters, thank you so much for this evening. I think I speak for all the staff that tonight's discussion was very helpful and very valuable, especially as we begin to really kind of start to move forward into the main part of the study. Looking ahead, we'll definitely incorporate the feedback that we received tonight on the guidance and really refine the guidance and add to it so that we'll then be able to begin moving forward in the building heights assessment with developing these kind of initial height scenarios and then evaluating them using the updated guidance. And I think as we do that, we'll be able to identify impacts, and then as we start to narrow our focus and iterate to kind of a refined height framework, we'll be able to then start to introduce the concept of allowing for additional height in return for community benefits. I know that was something that Commissioner All had mentioned, so I wanted to note that we're still moving forward into the study, into the building heights assessment. That will be a key component moving forward. In terms of our next steps, in terms of engagement with the LRPC, as Commissioner Scholl, I believe, mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, this entire study, we will be checking in with the LRPC multiple times. And so we plan to return to the LRPC in March and/or April as well to review the evaluation of height impacts and start to review kind of the work that we've done to arrive at a revised height framework. And so we'll definitely be coming back to engage and to get your all's feedback and input moving forward. And we're very excited to do so. And thank you again for all of your feedback tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy, for providing those next steps. And thanks to Mr. Lopez for his presentation this evening. Thanks to the members of the LRPC and members of the public who joined us tonight for providing your feedback and participating. So as Mr. Murphy noted, this is coming back to us later this spring, kind of for further feedback on and review of staff's work on the framework and the associated impacts. So stay tuned. Thanks again for your participation tonight. Stay safe and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.